Hi, and welcome to episode 2 of Steve's New Thing. Now, if you missed out on episode 1, Steve's New Thing is a show where, basically, if I have a special topic come to mind that I feel merits a extended discussion, this is where I'll spend a few moments talking about it. And on this episode, I'm going to talk about an album that I feel really fits the Halloween mood. It's something I always play around this time of year because it's very eerie and creepy and mood setting, and most of all, it's very underrated, I feel. That album is Pink Floyd's Ummagumma. Released in 1969, Ummagumma has always been one of Pink Floyd's most divisive albums, next to other controversial ones like The Final Cut and The Endless River. Ummagumma is a very eccentric and very unique album and really stands out among the rest of their catalog. It was their first two-record set, with one album being recorded live and the other recorded in a studio. Now, both albums really show what Pink Floyd were at this point in their careers, a band in transition, because only a year before, Syd Barrett was ousted from the band, and without their leader, the rest of the members didn't quite know where to go. Starting with the previous album they released, and the first after Syd, the soundtrack to the film More, they started experimenting with long, eerie, haunting instrumentals, more often than not anchored by Richard Wright playing the farfisa organ, as heard on songs like Cirrus Minor on More. And personally, I've always loved this period of Pink Floyd. In fact, since childhood, Ummagumma has been my favorite of their albums. I like that you can put it on and it sounds so eerie, sounds so almost otherworldly. Now let's look at this piece by piece, starting with the first record, the live album. Now, even though, admittedly, it's a little bit touched up, and if you find the Ummagumma live outtakes bootleg, you can actually hear what the live album sounded like in a rougher form, and with an extra song too. There's actually a Interstellar Overdrive that didn't make it onto the final album. But it really represents what they sounded like live at this time, where they didn't constrain themselves with time. They would just do long, improvisational, haunting versions of things like Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun. And the first time I heard this album back in elementary school, I immediately fell in love with the live album. Admittedly, at the time, I hadn't heard the original studio versions of things like Astronomy, Domine, or A Saucerful of Secrets. So I heard these first, and these are the definitive versions to me. Even to this day, having heard the original versions so many times over, I still always go back to the Ummagumma ones. I mean, I love how Astronomy Domine sort of has that eerie breakdown, the long instrumental break in the middle, and A Saucerful of Secrets, I feel, is just absolutely definitive on this album. I mean, the second section, the roaring guitar, and just the monstrous noises they get out of their instruments. I mean, imagine being the audience, possibly high, witnessing that happening. It's just, you would be wondering, where the hell are these sounds coming from? And the final section, Celestial Voices, has never ever sounded better than it does here. I mean, I believe that's actually tacked on from a different performance than the rest of Saucerful, but it's such a perfect sound. It's just that organ sound is just so spine-chilling, and I love the live album, I really do. And on the whole, most fans do seem to enjoy the live album. Unfortunately, it seems like with many fans, the live album is the only half of this album they will play, because the studio album is far more difficult and far less accessible. While at one point it seems like they had planned on a more conventional album, and you can hear a couple songs floating around from that idea. The album Relics has a song called Biding My Time, and there's also The Embryo, which originally appeared on a compilation without their permission, but it's more commonly known as being on the compilation album Works. But in the end, they decided to go with an interesting concept. Sort of what Kiss did years later, where they all put out a solo album on the same day, but Pink Floyd did that on a much smaller scale. All four members got half of a side. And what did they do with that half of a side? Well, each member created their own long, drawn-out experimental pieces with varying levels of success. The studio album starts with Richard Wright's Sysyphus, about the man who is doomed to roll a stone up and down a hill for all eternity. Now, the main theme is very memorable and one of the most, I feel, epic sounding pieces of music ever. While I'm not always quite sure what Richard is trying to convey in Sysyphus, it's very interesting because in, I believe it's about 12 minutes total, 4 parts, there's so many changes, so many different feelings, so many different moods. You know, there's the big, strong theme, and then there's the classical piano portion that devolves into just insanity, and then there's a very strange experimental section with sped up, almost chipmunk-like voices, and very reminiscent of several species of small furry animals, which we'll get to in a minute. And then a very dramatic return to the theme at the end. Overall, again, I don't know what he was trying to convey through this whole thing, but every part of it grabs you in some way. There's even a memorable scare chord, as one would call it, where the song seems to go dead and all of a sudden a chord just bursts in out of nowhere. I love that moment. Now, while the other members contributed just one long experimental piece each, Roger gets 2 songs. The first, well, a song and questionably a song, but we'll get to that. The first one is very enjoyable, Grantchester Meadows. Now, this is one of those classic Rodgers songs that shows what he was like before, you know, the anger and the politics and the memory of World War II and things like that really started to take over. You know, there's no sign of animals or the wall Roger Waters here. This is just a nice, relaxing song about enjoying a sunny English countryside, which segues directly into probably the strangest thing ever released under the Pink Floyd name. Rodgers' several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a Pict. This was, when I first bought this album in grade school, I loved this track. My buddy at the time had a karaoke machine with echo, and I loved to just mimic this track for hours. It's basically just Roger having fun with, you know, speeding up his own voice, looping his own voice, you know, creating almost like beatboxing squirrels and layering it all with himself doing this put-on Scottish accent, doing a poem, and it's such a bizarre, indescribable track. You know, it's not really something you could even call a song, really, but it's one of those things where if it didn't exist, I would be sad. You know, if Ummagumma were re-released without it, I would genuinely miss it. And it's fun to pick apart because, you know, he hid little messages here and there. You know, if you play the track at different speeds, you know, 78 RPM, 16 RPM, you'll hear different things pop out. And it's strange as hell, but I just really enjoy Rodgers' several species. That track is just amazing in its own little odd, unique way. Okay, so we're now halfway through the controversial studio album, and we really haven't heard anything that terrible so far. You know, Sysyphus had its merits, Grantchester Meadows is more or less a straightforward song, several species, if you're strange like me, can be enjoyable. So let's move on to Side 2. Side 2 starts with David Gilmour's The Narrow Way, which is a 3-part suite. Each part is very different. Part 1 is just a catchy little toe-tapping guitar instrumental, which had actually debuted in a BBC radio performance the year before. Part 2 really grabs the ear. Part 2 is a very repetitive, hard-driving riff. Some people have said it sort of reminds them of like a German 70s krautrock type song, and it just gets more and more distorted and very strange. Again, like Sysyphus, not sure what direction David was trying to go in with The Narrow Way, you know, what message he was trying to get across. But it's still interesting, it's strange, it's unusual, the music just gets very bizarre, and you know, you're not quite sure where it's going to turn. And then in the end, it turns into just a regular old song, you know, just a pleasant, mellow song, sort of like Grantchester Meadows with Part 3. And then the album wraps up with the Grand Vizier's Garden Party. I hope I'm pronouncing Vizier. It's a word people don't use anymore, I'm assuming. But this is Nick Mason's part. Well, sort of. Parts 1 and 3 are actually Nick Mason's then-wife playing the flute, and then Part 2 is a long track with Nick playing percussion instruments, you know, cutting them up, manipulating them, you know, doing different things to the tape with editing and pitch effects, and it's not something you listen to on repeat. It's very, this is just Nick in the studio with tapes having a good time. But it is interesting to hear, and it gets very spine-chilling in parts, that, like, deep, melodic, like, wind-like instrument. I still don't know how he made some of the sounds on this track, but it's very cool to hear, at least, just as a guy just experimenting with sound. So in the end, as I went through the tracks, it's kind of easy to see why the studio album is so divisive, because it's just a lot of experimentation, a lot of, unconventional music, not very accessible, especially to a casual Pink Floyd fan. I mean, you really have to go into Ummagumma knowing, the band was kind of lost at this point. They were just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. And as I mentioned on the individual songs, there are a lot of times when you're just saying, what is the meaning of this? Where are they trying to go with this song? And the answer is just, you don't know. It's just, these guys are just trying things, and you're listening to them try things. Maybe they didn't have a sole intention for Sysyphus or the Narrow Way. It's just, they did what interested them. And that's one of the reasons I love Ummagumma so much. I mean, again, yeah, live album, fantastic, especially if you like this period in their history. There are a lot of bootlegs out there of their live shows at this time that are similar. But I adore the studio album. I like the fact that you don't often hear a band just this unhinged. You don't often hear a band that's just saying, we have no direction right now. We just fired, 2 albums ago, our lead singer and the face of the band. We're just 4 guys, and we don't know what this band's meaning is right now. We don't know what direction we're going in, because all we've done since he left was just a movie soundtrack we were hired to do. Let's see what we can do in the studio. Let's see what odd sounds we can make. Let's see what interesting, unusual compositions we can do to try and be unique and set us apart from Syd Barrett's Pink Floyd. And it's so admirable in that regard. It's such a daring, risky, experimental album. And that's why it's my favorite, I think. I think hands down, except, okay, it's a big extreme between these two, except The Wall, because that was my first Pink Floyd album. I've seen the live show and things, so The Wall always will have a special place in my heart. But I think hands down, Ummagumma will always be my favorite Pink Floyd album, and that includes both halves. Now, I would definitely like to know what all of you think. Are there any Pink Floyd fans out there that just love this album as much as I do? Or do you hate this album? I mean, I'd love to hear you explain why. Is there a reason you just don't like this album? You skip it when you listen to Pink Floyd's albums. You prefer More or Atom Heart Mother and just bypass Ummagumma. Tell me about it. So thank you for joining me on this episode of Steve's New Thing. Just, it is an eerie album, it is a creepy album, it's Halloween week, hopefully I'll have this up in time, and I just need an excuse to talk about how much I like Ummagumma for a little bit. So thanks for hanging in with me, and I'll see you on the next time. I have a couple other ideas I'd like to make Steve's New Thing videos about. I think the next one I'm going to talk about was Chumbawamba underrated? That seems like a good topic. I think that's a topic I'd like to delve into. I am a big Chumbawamba fan, and so that'll be the next episode of Steve's New Thing when I get around to it. Got other new videos coming as well, so until then, you have a good evening.